So welcome. So my research was about international development and focusing on China's Belt and Road Initiative. And the main premise in sociology, there's a lot of literature and a lot of research that was done, not was done, that has been done on the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, on the World Bank, and a lot of their shortcomings. And a lot of their failures and whether or not they've made situations worse in different countries. So as a result, some research and some scholars have tried to seek perhaps alternatives. Is there other sources of financing countries can use for development? And one of the things that is thrown out there or that could perhaps challenge the World Bank and the IMF is China's Belt and Road Initiative. However, what I argue is that a lot of the issues and the problems that have been identified with the World Bank and the IMF are also identified here, and in some situations are actually worse. And so despite whatever we think about the IMF and the World Bank, and this is the conclusion to this isn't they're the best and wonderful organizations in the world. That's not what I'm saying. But if we are to choose an alternative, we have to be careful, and this may not be totally as advertised. So a little bit of background here. On March 14, 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative was officially launched. There's two main parts to it. I'll get into details in a second where you can even argue there's a few more, but it's mostly the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road. So here is China. And so the Silk Road Economic Belt is what's in red, and it's connecting China throughout other parts of Asia and then also reaches Europe. And then you have the Maritime Silk Road, so connecting China to other parts of Southeast Asia and then closer to India, and then actually reaches Africa into the Middle East. And by 2019, about 6 years after it started, there were 138 countries that signed a memorandum of understanding to be part of it. And as of January of last year, it reached 152 countries. So that number might be changed slightly now. Italy just pulled out of it, but more countries are looking to join. So it's a give or take 152 or so countries. And again, within the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road, there are specific aspects to it. So we have the economic corridor of China, Mongolia, and Russia. Over here, the new Eurasian land bridge over here, the economic corridor of China and Central Asia, so more over here, the economic corridor of China and the Indo-Chinese Peninsula, so more over here, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is hugely significant in this infrastructure economic development thing. And then the Maritime Economic Corridor, also very important. And for our research, we're going to talk about primarily what's happening in Africa. And you can't do that without talking about the blue line here, the economic corridor that's now reaching the eastern coast of Africa and then goes up to Suez and so on. So again, the World Bank International Monetary Fund formed after World War II to provide either financing to help countries balance their books that are running up high deficits, or provide small loans for infrastructure and other means of economic development. But there's a lot of strings attached when you accept financing or accept loans. It's called structural adjustment. You don't just get the money. You have to do X, Y, Z. You have to do a bunch of things to show that you're making necessary reforms. And a lot of countries end up in a situation where you have to borrow way more than one time. Argentina is an example of this. Egypt's an example of this, where they get fined. Or Greece during the European debt crisis, another one where you have to accept multiple loans and multiple reforms, and it can get very ugly and messy at times. And so as a result, people have tried to seek alternatives because research that's been done shows that these structural adjustment loans from the World Bank and IMF at times have increased infant mortality rates, have damaged clean water and sanitation, have increased maternal mortality rates, particularly in sub-Saharan African countries, increases in deforestation as well. And so the main research question Is the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, a positive alternative to this? Should countries seek to gain financing and small loans for development and infrastructure and things from China rather than go through what we've had set up since the end of the Second World War? Or should this be avoided as well and then either continue to work with the IMF and World Bank or try to find even another alternative? And then is this a positive alternative? So there's a lot of forums and meetings with world leaders that are involved with the Belt and Road Initiative. Or is this just the latest mechanism for poor countries to be exploited, much like they have been in other circumstances? And so the main country behind it, as I was saying, is China. It's part of Xi Jinping's, what he's calling the Chinese dream, trying to increase interconnectedness and interdependence around the world, trying to create what he's called a global village, what's been referred to as big power diplomacy, also increasing South-to-South cooperation, referring to the global South working with each other rather than dealing with the global North or the West, or the status quo since the end of the Second World War, have the global South work together to help one another and share success with one another. So that's like the idea, at least in theory, behind the Belt and Road Initiative, at least from the perspective of China. But there are problems with this. It can be described as like a loose portfolio of disparate projects. China also invests in international development and aid in other countries that are not considered part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's hard to tell what exactly counts as being part of the Belt and Road Initiative and what's not. There's not clear stipulations or qualifications for what counts and doesn't. There's also no official figures when it comes to how much has already been loaned to other countries by China. There's no independent coordinating government agency. So despite whatever you might think of the World Bank and IMF, there's transparency in those systems. You can see how much they've loaned other countries, what they're trying to do. You may not agree with what they're doing. You may not agree with the amounts or how they're going about it. But the more Western organizations are typically more transparent. So if you have the same issues going on, as I'll kind of lay out here with a few case study examples, in addition to the lack of transparency and accountability, this could set up for a really bad situation down the road. That's basically my main premise and argument, and that it could be far more of a nightmare than perhaps a dream. One of the criticisms that the IMF and the World Bank get is that it puts countries in debt traps. Besides the Belt and Road Initiative, Djibouti, for example, owed over $1 billion to China by the end of 2019. That's 36% of its GDP. That may not seem like a lot, but for a small country, it's a tremendous amount. And some of the projects behind the mass accumulation of this debt is the Dorala multipurpose port, as pictured here, which would be very, very important for the maritime Silk Road, and also a major railway that connects the capital of Ethiopia to Djibouti as well. So again, these countries are accepting money from China to help develop ports, to help build roads, to help build railways, and in many cases have zero chance of paying it back, okay, or very little chance of being able to pay back this kind of money. Again, so we have financing different railways as well. So we have the coast. So this would be where the maritime Silk Road is. And then you have railways connecting the coast deeper into other countries as well. So China is lending a lot of money to these countries to be able to have these things. But again, Ethiopia, another country that owes billions of dollars to China, and there's no real way yet for them to pay this back. So does China, take the loss? Does China refinance? Does China seize the port, seize the railway, which it often has done in different infrastructure projects in other countries? And what does that mean in terms of then the long-term money that's going to cost China to maintain these infrastructure projects? Lots of things to consider, lots of risk is what I'm also trying to stress here. China has also expressed hesitation to invest in Egypt beyond the Suez industrial zone. So basically, when it comes to like urban and rural sociology, also the foundation of this, unless you're in the major metropolitan areas of these recipient countries, you're often excluded. So the more vulnerable urban populations or the people who live in more rural areas or on the outskirts of where most of the economic activity is for a particular country often get ignored when it comes to any kind of projects that might benefit them. So again, this Chinese dream of interconnectedness and interdependence, mostly for the main, in Egypt's case, it's just so far been for those in more metropolitan areas, and that continues to also be the case in most other countries that have been recipients of Chinese aid. These projects are also unsustainable. So just because you build an infrastructure project of sorts does not mean you have the capabilities of maintaining it, and does not mean it is the money-making venture you might think it is. So even after you build, for example, the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway in Kenya, that was built in 2017. During its first year of operation, it lost $100 million. Okay, so that's the other problem here, is not only do you have to pay China back for that, but you just lost $100 million. And obviously you would want those projects to be on the opposite side. You want them to be in the green and to generate revenue to help pay China back. But now you're making a bad situation even worse. There's also environmental degradation. So just as I was saying, there's these problems with the IMF and the World Bank. There's also these problems when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative. Egypt and Nigeria, projects in those countries have fallen short of China's ESG, environmental social governance standards. There's also pollution, deforestation, damage done to indigenous lands and populations happening in Ethiopia. African wildlife and biodiversity will have to be monitored. So again, the case studies I use for this paper are mostly African countries, and the reason why they'll have to be monitored is there's also been significant damage in Indonesia and Myanmar, and so if there's damage in those countries, odds are African wildlife and biodiversity will also be negatively impacted as well. Okay, so again, it's a lot of the same problems, only the problems are worse, either worse, or there's no transparency, accountability, or things behind the causes to the problems. And so this could magnify an already bad situation and magnify the problems that the IMF and the World Bank have often had fingers point at them for. But it could be easier to deal with those organizations. And also perhaps if we are to try to seek other alternatives, which I think is okay. Again, this isn't like a pro-West, pro-IMF World Bank paper. The paper cites numerous examples of where those agencies fall short, but we have to be careful when trying to find a better alternative. And this may not be as advertised by China. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and thank you again for having me.